Good afternoon and welcome to our Christian Chapel Bible study. Today is Wednesday, February the 28th, and we're so glad you could join us. Have you ever heard someone make this statement? God will never give you more than you can bear, or God will never put more on you than you can handle. I think good-meaning people who say this are usually trying to encourage someone who is suffering or going through a very difficult situation. And to say that God will never give you more than you can handle, it sure sounds good, but it's just not the truth. And I want to take this time to share with you why that's not the truth. When people make this statement, that God will never give you more than you can handle or that you can bear, they're usually referring to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, which reads, "No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it." Now, if we read this in context, and remember we talked about context from last Wednesday night, context. Well, if you study the Bible, you have to read a scripture in context. You just can't pull a scripture out and make it whatever you want it to be. We have to read it in context. And if we read this scripture in context, we're able to understand that the thing that God will never allow us to have more than we can bear is temptation. It's not trials, it's not sufferings, it's temptations. So let's look at this in context, and we're going to look at the scripture that all of this is embedded in. So it's going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, beginning with verse 1. "Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud and passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food. All drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ." But listen to what verse 5 says. But with most of them, God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now, these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted, and do not become idolaters, as some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And I don't think that word play meant a good play. Verse 8, nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. Nor complain, as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now, all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. At the end of chapter 9, Paul is encouraging the believers in Corinth to practice strict spiritual discipline like he did. So chapter 10 begins with the word moreover, or knowing that, think about this. It continued the thought that we should be disciplined. The Corinthians should be disciplined. We should be disciplined. Paul talks about Israel's sins of idolatry, sexual immorality, testing God, grumbling, and complaining. And when he talks about these things, he's not talking about trials and sufferings. So when Paul gets down to 1 Corinthians 10:13, the context demands we understand he is writing about temptation to sin. Sin stalks us, but God is faithful and God provides a way of escape so that we can resist. So there's not a temptation that we face that we're unable to resist or to bear. When people when people take those words about temptation to sin and they apply them to trials and suffering, then they make the statement not true. In fact, the opposite is true. God does allow us to have more than we can handle. God does allow us to have more than we can handle sometimes. Paul reminds us of that truth, that sometimes God allows us to have more than we can bear, not temptation, but trials and sufferings. And Paul reminds us of that truth in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8. Listen to what he says. For we do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, of our trouble which came to us in Asia, not temptation, but trouble, that we were burdened beyond measure, above strength, so that we despaired even of life. They were burdened beyond measure, beyond what they could bear. They were burdened beyond their strength to the point that they despaired even of life. Yes, they were overwhelmed beyond their ability to endure, and they thought they would not live through it. In fact, they pretty much expected to die. So when Paul is saying this, he is saying the suffering that he was going through that period of his life was more than he could handle or bear. It was overwhelming. It was suffering beyond measure. So, why does God allow us, or why does he allow for us to go through sufferings which are more than we can bear? Why does God allow us to have trials and sufferings that is beyond measure, that is more than we're able to bear? Well, Paul gives us the answer to that in the very next verses 8, 9, and 10. Let's look at these verses 8, 9, and 10 together. For we do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, of our trouble which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened beyond measure, above strength, that we despaired even of life. Yes, verse 9 says, we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead, who delivered us from so great a death and does deliver us, in whom we trust that he will still deliver us. And Paul, may I add, the God who always delivers us through his love and grace and mercy. Paul again wrote about the reason God allows us to have more than we can bear in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. Listen to these words. Paul says, "And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me," listen to this, "My grace is sufficient for you. My grace is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me." And verse 10, "Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Paul gives another example of being overwhelmed by this thorn in the flesh, being overwhelmed by it. And he came to the conclusion that even in this suffering, probably we know for sure that it was more suffering than Paul wanted, overbearing, overwhelming. In this suffering, God comes to him through Christ and gives him strength in his weakness. God allows us to be burdened, to suffer, to have trials greater than we can bear, overwhelming, so that we will not depend on our own strength, but that we will depend on God's strength. When I am weak through Christ, then I am strong. To say God will never give you more than you can handle, or God will never give you more than you can bear, it sounds good, but it just isn't biblical. It's not biblical. Paul tells us it was when he did not have the strength to face his own suffering that he found God's power and faithfulness was sufficient to provide what he needed. Let me repeat that. Paul tells us when he did not have the strength to face his own suffering, when that suffering was overwhelming, when it was unbearable, he found God's power and faithfulness was sufficient to meet his need, to provide exactly what he needed. So, in 1 Corinthians 10:13, Paul lays out an escape from temptation. That we all face temptations. We're not immune to temptations. But with every temptation that comes our way, God has a way of escape so that we do not have to bear it. That is temptations. That is not suffering. That is not trials. In our suffering and in our trials, they can be overwhelming. They can be overbearing. And that's when Paul came to the conclusion that through his suffering, that sometime even as we read one time, even at the point of death, his suffering was beyond measure. You couldn't even measure the suffering that he was going through, that he found God's power and faithfulness was sufficient to provide all that he needed. You see, when I rely on me to get through suffering, to get through these trials, man, it does become overwhelming. It becomes more overwhelming than I can even imagine. But when we face these burdens and the suffering that is overwhelming, that is beyond measure, that is more than we're able to bear, we understand that in our weakness, in these times, God, Christ, brings us everything we need through his grace. And in my weakness, it's then I am made strong. Think about this. When you tell someone that God will not put more on you than you can bear, the person you are speaking to may be going through what Paul was going through, suffering and trials beyond measure, overwhelming, actually more than they can bear. If you tell them that God won't put more on you than you can bear, it may lead them to think that they're not even Christian for feeling overwhelmed in their suffering that Paul described as suffering beyond measure. They may think that, well, if God won't put more on me than I can bear, I'm not a Christian, or I would be handling this. I should be handling this. It shouldn't be overwhelming. Nothing could be farther from the truth. To tell someone that God will not allow more suffering and trials than you can bear is absolutely unbiblical. In our attempt to encourage someone who is suffering, let me suggest the following phrase here. God will give you all the grace you need in every situation. I would not say God will not give you more than you can bear, just isn't true. But we can say God will give you all the grace you need in every situation, no matter how much suffering people face and how deeply they hurt because of that suffering. They need to know the truth that God's grace is sufficient for them in all of their needs. Not that it won't be overwhelming or more than they can bear, but in those situations, God's going to give them all the grace they need in that situation. Focusing on our suffering and our ability to handle it doesn't bring comfort. Focusing on God and his resources for us in suffering brings great comfort, brings great hope. It's not in myself, but in my weakness, I am made strong through the grace of God in Jesus Christ. God will give you all the grace you need in every situation. God bless you today. And I know that he is giving us his grace to face all the trials and suffering and burdens that we are facing right now. I hope that you have a good rest of this week. And I hope, man, we had such a good service last Sunday. I hope to see you this Sunday. God bless you. I love you.